Hi there, and welcome to MadPow's webinar series. For those of you not familiar with us, we are a design agency that strives to help people improve their health and wellness, meet their financial goals, learn, and connect. But enough about us. Today, Dan Berlin, VP of Experience Research, will share his insights on your psychologist voice, leveraging voice mindfulness for UX research. A little bit about Dan. Dan performs both traditional and novel user experience research techniques. All for client engagements are varied. Dan helps determine which research activities are most appropriate and will collect the most usable data for the particular project. After 7 years working with hard-to-use interfaces and technical support, Dan found user experience design calling after participating in a usability study. After graduating from Bentley, Dan spent 2 years in an interactive agency performing usability and neuromarketing research studies. For the latter research, Dan investigated eye tracking and biofeedback methodologies as he presented extensively on these topics. Dan is an active member of the Usability Professionals Association, holds a BA in psychology from Brandeis University, and is particularly interested in visual space perception. As if that's not enough, Dan currently serves as the president of the Boston chapter of UXPA. So now that you know him, here are a few housekeeping items before we get started. We'll be sure to leave 15 minutes at the end for questions, so make sure you put them in the sidebar as a direct message to me, the host, or to the group. We'll be live tweeting with #MadPow, and slides will be available on our site in a couple of days. Notifications will be sent through our social media channels, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, Google+, so be sure you're following us on all channels. There you can also learn about upcoming webinars, speaking engagements, events, and more. And with that, I'll pass it over to Dan.
Great, thank you, Liz. Hi, everyone. My name is Dan Berlin, and I'm going to be chatting with you for the next 45 minutes or so. Thank you very much for joining. And we're going to be chatting about in today's talk, we're going to be talking about these 5 things overall. We're going to start with qualitative research overall and the different ways that we moderate qualitative research. And then we'll start going into the voice and the components of your voice and how those components turn into the psychologist's voice when put together in the right way. We'll move on from there into nonverbal communication a little bit and then end with voice mindfulness, putting it all together and being mindful of our voice at all times, especially during UX research. So just a little bit more about me. As was mentioned, I have a BA in psychology from Brandeis. But coming out of undergrad with a psychology degree, there's not much you can do there, so I spent 7 years doing technical support for video-on-demand systems. And then one day I was sitting as a participant in a usability study, and I had no idea that this world existed. So after that usability study, I quit my job and did the 2.5-year program at Bentley to get an MBA and an MS in Human Factors and Information Design. Since then, I've been doing UX research for the past 8 years, and I'm currently the Vice President of Experience Research here at MadPow. We have a team of 4 researchers who are dedicated researchers who perform the different research needed for MadPow projects. So that's just a little bit about me. So qualitative research. What you're looking at are 4 different pictures of 4 different types of qualitative research. And this is what we mean by qualitative research, where we're doing a lot of talking. We're not doing surveying, where we're relying on Likert scales or anything quantitative. It's really all about listening to folks, noting what they're saying, and finding those trends in the qualitative data based on your notes. So going around the circle here, what you're seeing in the top left is a focus group, a traditional marketing focus group, where everyone is going to talk with each other and being led by that moderator, the facilitator. This is a more traditional method, a qualitative method, has its roots in marketing, not one that's used very often in user experience research, as at least here, feel that in focus groups, one participant tends to either dominate the conversation or we don't hear from one participant because they don't like speaking up or are getting talked over. But we do the occasional focus group. The top right is a one-on-one interview where they are just having a one-on-one conversation. You can see the recorder that's recording the conversation. And the idea here is just having, again, that one-on-one conversation with someone. And this can be done in a lab, over the phone, really anywhere, which is why we like doing one-on-one user interviews, because we can do them anywhere. We can easily get geographic spread. And you're just having that one-on-one conversation with a person. So you can really dig pretty deep on the things that they're saying and not relying on the groupthink of a focus group. In the lower right is an ethnographic observation or contextual inquiry, where we are in someone's home and we are looking at what they're doing as they're doing it in their natural environment. Ethnographic observation is a wonderful qualitative method in that we're not in an artificial environment like a lab or a focus group room. We're watching people in their homes or in their office and asking the right questions, but also observing what they're doing and observing how they're interacting with their environment and how that influences the thing that we're investigating. Maybe it's a website, maybe it's a physical device. But getting into people's homes and offices is a great way to get at that. And then finally, in the lower left, what you're seeing is our usability lab at MadPow Boston. You're seeing it from the observation room into the lab itself, and me sitting with a participant. And in a usability study, it's similar to an interview where it's a one-on-one situation. But instead of just relying on the questions, we give participants tasks to perform on an interface, whether it's a website, a piece of software, a mobile app, or even a physical device. And the moderator stays generally quiet during this and just watches what the participant is doing, but of course asks probing questions as they go to get at the participant and to really understand what the participant is thinking about their interactions with the interface. And the common thread amongst all of these different methods is the fact that they are qualitative and really rely on a moderator who can facilitate well, who can ask the right questions at the right time, who can build rapport with the participants, and generally is just really good at drawing out that qualitative data from the participants as well as the observations being done. So why is this important? So our time with participants is precious. And what you're seeing here is me sitting with a participant in our lab during a usability study. And our time with these participants is very precious because bringing in participants is expensive. We have to pay a recruiter to get them in the door. We have to pay the participant for their time. And then depending on the amount of time we're spending with them, we may have to increase the incentive, the amount we pay them. But for a 1-hour session with Joe Schmo off the street, that could be $200 a person. So we want to really maximize the data that we're getting out of participants during these studies so that we don't have to bring in 20, 30 people. We can really get great data from 10, 12 people. So how are we going to get the best possible information from participants? By keeping them relaxed, comfortable, and we want them to, and when they're relaxed and comfortable, they're going to be ready to share their innermost thoughts and dreams. And that is really what we're hoping for. We want people to react to what they're seeing, but we want them to be as honest as possible. We don't want them giving answers that they think the moderator wants. We really want to get at those honest answers. And we found that, and experience has shown that a relaxed participant will provide that honest and useful data, as opposed to a tense participant who may be hard to control or go off on tangents or distant when talking with the facilitator. A distant participant, or one that is not really giving much information, is a waste of money, for lack of a better term. We spent that $200, but they're tense and we're not getting good information from them. That's $200 out the door. So we want to maximize that $200 and keep participants calm and relaxed and build a nice rapport with them so that you can have a nice conversation with them. That's what we're trying to do here is have that conversation. We don't want it to be, whereas it is a participant moderator relationship, we still want them to be very comfortable and relaxed to get that data. And the best practices that we hear about in qualitative research don't really talk about your voice or speaking. They tend to concentrate on the artifacts that we have during a study or the methodologies. What do I mean by artifacts and methodologies? So the preparation and the things that we do, the documentations, the techniques. So for a given usability study, we always have a participant screener that indicates how we're going to recruit these folks and what questions they're going to ask of potential participants. We have the study guide that outlines what the study is going to, how the study is going to go, and then typically the report. And these best practices, again, concentrate on the documentation and techniques. For instance, asking non-leading questions. We want to ask questions that are as neutral as possible, but still get at the things that we want to learn about. Same for usability studies. We want the tasks in the usability study to be non-leading. We don't want to give them the answer in the task itself. Another methodology point are the different types of questions that we ask during a study to elicit different types of data. And then the activities that we have people do, whether it's a usability study or maybe collaging, where we have them do some storytelling based on pictures that they choose, or other methodologies that allow us to get at qualitative data. But again, these best practices really typically focus on those artifacts and methodology. Yes, there are some great books out there in terms of best practices for moderating qualitative research overall and moderating usability studies. But what I found in my travels is that there's very little research on how to carry your voice. And how to carry your voice is, I think, one of the most important skills that a qualitative moderator needs to build, because it's not like having a conversation with your friends when you're in the lab with a participant. You are facilitating the conversation. You're not just having a conversation. And a moderator needs to listen a lot more. They need to actively listen so that we can ask the appropriate follow-up questions that align with what the participant said with the goals of the study. So we have to be constantly thinking about what the next question is based on what the participant is saying while still actively listening. And we want to do this in such a way, as I mentioned earlier, that the participant remains nice and calm. If the moderator gets a little uppity and is obviously thinking about the next thing they want to say, or there's an awkward silence because of the moderator, the participant may get a little tense and may not talk as much. And so this is something I've noticed over my years of moderating studies, that there's very little people who talk about how to carry your voice. And that actually changed recently. So I actually gave this talk as a very brief keynote at UXPA Boston's conference in May. And then soon thereafter, someone sent me this TED video. And I suggest that everyone go watch this after this webinar, because it's a brief, nice brief TED talk by Julian Treasure called "How to Speak So That People Want to Listen." And this was really the first I heard of someone talking about your voice and how to carry your voice, and really concentrating on the components of your voice. So Julian actually talked about exactly what I was talking about in that initial talk. So I suggest you go check it out. And these next couple of slides are stolen directly from him, so go check him out as well. So it's really all about what and how you say it. So first off, we have to be mindful of what we're saying. And these are Julian's 7 deadly sins of talking. And these all we want to avoid all negativity when in the room with participants. We want to avoid really any. We want to build empathy with the participants, yeah, we may say something in order to agree with them, but we don't really want to harp on it. So being mindful of what you're saying in the lab or in the interview in general is really important. And concentrating on avoiding negative talk is the key there. So instead, speak with these 4 things. Again, I attribute this to Julian: honesty, authenticity, integrity, and love. When you speak with honesty and authenticity, when you're in the room with participants, they'll pick up on that, and they'll be more open and honest with you because they'll pick up that you're being open and honest with them. And that's what this is really all about. Again, we want to get the best possible data from these participants, and if we're honest with them, they'll be honest with us. So this is the first part of being mindful of what you're saying. Again, avoiding being negative and speaking openly and honestly. But the real crux of the psychologist's voice is how you're saying it. And these are the different components of your voice. And we're going to stop here and check this out for a little bit now. So there are, so we'll start with pace. So how fast you're talking. So for the past 10 minutes or so, I've been talking at a very even, moderate pace because I'm giving a webinar over the phone. If I started talking like this, not many people would understand me, and that would be the case if I was in the lab with a participant. On the flip side, if I were talking too slow, then the participant may lose interest, and no one wants that. So we want to keep a nice, reasonable pace as we go. The power is where your voice is coming from, so being mindful of whether your voice is coming from your belly, your chest, your nose, or your throat. Where your voice is coming from is an important component of your voice. The volume, so the loudness with which you're talking. So we don't want participants to be saying what every couple of minutes because they can't hear us because of a low volume. We also don't want to blow their ears away with talking very loud, so we have to be mindful of what our volume is. The timbre of your voice, so which is the warmth or the smoothness of your voice. Again, we want to be as warm and inviting as possible. Emphasis, so putting the stress on the key words or syllables. Some folks will not put the emphasis where needed or not talk with emphasis. And when we talk with emphasis, we draw out those key words that give participants insight into exactly what we're talking about and points them in the direction we're asking about. So emphasizing the right words is very important. Pausing for emphasis, so stopping every now and again. If we just keep talking and talking, the participant's going to lose interest or possibly get confused. And then the pitch and inflection, the depth and inflection of your voice. Again, making sure that you have the right pitch, that you have the ups and downs of your sentences. And there's a lot of different ideas out there as to how to make participants feel at ease when you are in the room with them. What you should do to control your voice. Again, regarding the components that I was just talking about. But I don't think there are really any easy answers when it comes to the best way to carry your voice. Some folks say that you should match the participant's tone and the pace. But if this tone and pace is not the way you usually speak, it can be very unnatural and come off as unnatural, and the participants will pick up on that. And if it's done really incorrectly, participants may think that the moderator is mocking them. So that's one way that I'm not a big fan of, so matching the participant. Another way is just being yourself. But as I mentioned earlier, we really don't think about how we speak enough. We don't really pay that much attention to how we speak. So if you're just being yourself, you may have this booming voice that is intimidating to the participant. Or you may have this very small voice that doesn't command authority and the participant kind of ignores you. These are the two main ones that we hear a lot in the UX world as to the best way to talk to participants. But what I'm positing here is the third way, the psychologist's voice. So rhetorical question because you can't raise your hands out there, but how many of you out there have heard of Dr. Bruce Serkin? I'll let you all raise your hands. All right, good. So Dr. Bruce Serkin was the school psychologist at Bethpage High School on Long Island, where I went to high school. So not many people have heard of Dr. Bruce Serkin. But he imparted some great wisdom back in high school that I take to heart today. And so this is the story of where the psychologist's voice came from. So when I was in high school, I was a part of this group talk where a couple of my friends and I would go to Dr. Serkin's office on a weekly basis and just talk things out, talk about school and the things going on. And we did this for a while, a number of months, actually a number of years. And early on, Dr. Serkin had a normal everyday voice like we have when we're talking with our friends. There was nothing that stood out about his voice. And then one day I walked into Dr. Serkin's office and his voice had completely changed. He was now talking much slower. He was talking with a much smoother voice, a much deeper voice, and you can tell that he had changed the way he was talking with us. And I said, Dr. Serkin, what's going on here? What happened? And he said, well, I'm practicing my psychologist voice. Dr. Serkin was fairly early on in his career at that point, and he was moving on to psychology, and he wanted to put patients at ease. And that's exactly what I remembered when I started moderating usability studies. I came back to Dr. Serkin and remembered his psychologist voice, and then applied that to moderating usability and other qualitative research. And I find that it really does indeed help put participants at ease. So what are the components of the psychologist voice? So going back to the components of the voice and adding the psychologist aspect to it, okay, the pace is very even and calm. Again, we don't want to rush. We don't want to have the participant have to parse what we're saying because we are talking too fast. That nice, even, calm pace is very easy to listen to. The power. Where's your power? Power of your voice comes from your belly or your chest. It does not come from your mouth or your throat. And being mindful of where your voice is coming from is important. So talking from your belly, using your diaphragm to talk, will produce more power, and you will talk with more authority and draw more attention to what you're saying. Again, making the participant not have to ask what a lot. The volume, again, audible but not too loud. We don't want that booming voice in the room, especially if we're in a small room together. Maybe the lab is small, maybe it's echoey, maybe it's not very soundproofed, and it goes back to the echo. So we have to be very mindful of what our volume is. Again, the timbre, we want that timbre to be warm and soothing. We don't want to come off as cold. Ensuring to emphasize the right words, so stressing those right words within the sentence. By putting the emphasis on the right word in your sentence, you're going to draw attention to the questions, to the important things of the questions at hand. Pausing to stop. So some folks don't really stop when they're talking. And pausing to emphasize key points is really critical, whether you're presenting to a crowd or you're asking questions of a participant. So making sure that you stop at those key points so that the participant definitely understands that what you're trying to convey. The depth of your voice, again, we want to have a slightly deeper voice to command authority, so you have to just talk where you are comfortable. And then the inflection. No one wants to listen to someone who talks like this and it's very monotone and it gets very uninteresting if they talk. So avoiding monotone speak. And we get monotone when we're concentrating more on what we're saying as opposed to how we're saying it. So again, concentrate on both. Be prepared with what you're saying and say it in such a way that it's drawing the participant's attention, it's not putting them to sleep, it's emphasizing the key words, and most importantly, that it's keeping the participant calm and comfortable. And that's why the psychologist voice is so important. A psychologist's voice keeps patients, or in this case participants, calm and comfortable and open and honest. And by being mindful of all of these voice components, when you're in the room with participants, you can really draw out those great qualitative insights that you wouldn't be able to do otherwise if the participant was a little put off or didn't trust you. So the real takeaway here is keep these components in mind as you're talking to participants. Again, whether it's on the phone or in person, doing ethnographic observation, or even leading a focus group. Bearing these in mind, you're going to get better information, more useful information out of your qualitative research. And going beyond the psychologist's voice, there are other things that we should be keeping in mind when in the room with participants. Nonverbal communication is huge. There's a great book out there where this graph came from, where it indicates that when we're talking with folks, 55% of what they're picking up on are nonverbal communication cues, how we're carrying ourselves. The 38% is tone of voice, so everything we've been talking about so far with the psychologist's voice. And then the last 7% are what we're saying. So you can see that the nonverbal communication plus the tone of voice makes up the bulk of how people are listening to us, how they are taking us in. And then the spoken words just come after that. And I thoroughly believe this. So we have to be very cognizant of our nonverbal communication as well as that tone of voice. So what are some takeaways in terms of conveying positive nonverbal communication? First off, your posture. If you're slouching while you're in the room with a participant, you're going to convey disinterest. Keep nice and straight. Keep that eye contact as best you can, and indicate interest with your body. Your facial expressions. You want them to be appropriately responsive. Don't let your inner thoughts dictate what your facial expressions are doing. You want your facial expressions to be responsive. If they say something surprising, you can express surprise, with your eyebrows. If they say something sad, you can sympathize with them by giving a little frown. These slight little facial expressions really go a long way in how we are perceived by the participants. The distance with which you're talking to the participant. So keeping that optimum conversational distance. And this is something that needs to be gauged with each participant because everyone has different levels of comfort with personal space. Some people don't need much personal space. Some people need a lot. And this is something that you can kind of gauge when you greet the participant in the waiting room, when you first shake their hand. You may be able to determine, all right, how much personal space does this person need? And I'm going to remember that when I'm in the room with them. Your voice tone. Again, you want to keep it nice and conversational. You want the person to open up to you. You want the whole thing to be a conversation. You don't want a participant to see you as a moderator or a facilitator. I'm sure they will either way, but we want them to think of the moderator as a confidant, telling us their hopes and dreams, wants and needs, because that's really what we're trying to get at when doing this qualitative UX research. So keeping a conversational tone will help with that. Body movements. So again, conveying interest by facing them squarely and leaning in where appropriate, where they say something interesting. This is something that we would do in normal conversation. This is something that we should do when we're in the room with the participant. And just being more mindful of it. Same with the mannerisms. So if you have distracting mannerisms, they may convey disinterest. They may be distracting, just like that. I have a nasty habit of spinning a pen, that's fine in work meetings, but when I'm sitting in the room with a participant, that can be very distracting and have to be mindful of that. And mindfulness is something that I've said a few times here today. And that's actually the big takeaway of being a lot more mindful of your voice, of your body, and how your voice and body and what these are conveying to the participants. In everyday conversation, we're not really thinking about these things. But when we are in a room with a participant, when we're in the lab with a participant, we need to be extremely mindful of how we're carrying our voice and how we're carrying our body so that the participants, again, are as calm and comfortable as possible, so that they are honest and give us great data. And this is not to say that you have to be the stereotypical 1950s psychiatrist, overly evenly toned. On the contrary, you can still show emotion, and you should. We want to convey to participants that we are a confidant, and we want to empathize with them. But we don't need to be their friend. We want to convey that we are a confidant and keep them relaxed as best as possible. But there are some things that we can take away from that stereotypical 1950s psychotherapist. First off, listening to listen and to understand. In everyday conversation, we're typically listening in order to respond and interject. We're thinking of the next thing that we're going to say. But when we're in the room with participants, we need to be more mindful of that. And we should be listening to listen. We should really be listening to participants, thinking about what they're saying, and then applying that to the study goals and figuring out what's coming next. Asking why multiple times without using the word why if possible. This is a technique called laddering that we're big fans of here at the MadPower research team. And the idea here is really getting at the core values of what the participant is feeling. And there are great ways of doing this without asking why like a petulant child. Tell me how you feel about that. Tell me more about that. What's your reaction to this? These are all different ways of asking why without asking the word why. And great way to get at those core values. Turning questions back onto participants. Ask participants to answer their own questions before you do, because that way we can hear how they're thinking about things. And this is something that we wouldn't necessarily do in everyday conversation, but it's a great way to elicit what participants are thinking and how they're thinking about the question at hand. Confirming that we are gathering the right information, that we're gathering the things that the person said. So we can say things like, just to confirm, you felt X because of Y. Is that correct? Is there another way to put it? And by asking those questions, the participant may reiterate themselves to make sure that we gathered that data properly, that we're not missing anything. And then finally, keeping quiet. Keep the participants talking. Awkward silences are just that. They're awkward. They are not, but they're something that we try to avoid in everyday conversation. But when you're in the lab with participant, awkward silences are okay. The participant is going to feel compelled to fill it in with words. And it's always better when the participant is talking, not the moderator. So let the participant fill in those awkward silences. And of course, if you need to do it, you'll feel free to do so. But ideally, the participant fills those awkward silences. And again, when you're in the room with participants and they're talking, we need to convey that there are no wrong answers. So never sounding disappointed with an answer. Again, being very mindful of how we're saying things and not letting our emotions come out when we're saying them. So you never want to sound disappointed. We always want to be interested in what they're saying. We want to convey interest in what they're saying. Even if what they're saying at the present moment is a tangent, that tangent may come back to something interesting, and you may get a piece of data that you wouldn't get otherwise. So whereas we want to sometimes reel in tangents to keep things on track and make the most of our hour, sometimes it's okay to let that go and see where it goes, and then reel it in. And then finally, you always want to convey that the participant is the expert. We're bringing them in and we're listening to them because they are the expert on whatever it is that we're talking about. Maybe we are doing research for an app that helps diabetics. And we bring in folks with diabetes to talk about it. They are definitely an expert on that domain. And that's why we're talking with them. And so convey that to them. Remind them of that as to why they're in the room and why we're talking to them. Make them feel special. And then again, They'll be open and honest and giving you great data. And all of what I'm talking about here is also useful outside of the lab setting and outside of conducting research. Being mindful of your voice and your nonverbal communication can be used for difficult conversations. I mean, we talk all day long without thinking about how we're delivering our words. And we need to start being a lot more mindful of that. Out of the lab, we're going to have better relationships and have better conversations with people. And generally, we let our emotions guide our voice, for better or for worse. So if we put on our psychologist voice, maybe we can calm contentious situations. Maybe you can calm yourself before an important interview or before meeting an important person. So using the psychologist voice in everyday life can help yourself, again, have better relationships, have better conversations, and definitely in the lab, get better data out of participants. So how are you going to do this? Well, practicing voice mindfulness. And what do I mean by mindfulness? This is a word I've been throwing out there for the past 40 minutes. Mindfulness is the active attention to what we're doing. Always being paying that active attention to what we're saying, to what we're doing, to the present. Always thinking about the present. Again, in everyday conversation, we're typically listening in order to respond. When we're being mindful, we are listening for listening, and we're paying active attention to what the person is saying, and we absorb more that way, and we can have better conversations. And so, voice mindfulness is that active attention to how you're conveying your words. I'm obviously doing voice mindfulness while giving this webinar because I want people to understand me and to have the good takeaways of the important parts. But again, outside in everyday conversation, we tend not to be as mindful. So really practicing this voice mindfulness and how you're conveying your words will be very helpful. And it is tough to transcend that unconscious behavior. Again, we just kind of go. We don't practice mindfulness, and everything we do starts out unconsciously and then gets out to the world So we need to start thinking about our unconscious behavior and thinking about the things that we're thinking about, and transcending that unconscious behavior and thinking about what we're doing more. Warming up your voice is a fun thing to do maybe before a study, before a webinar. If you go back and watch that Julian Treasure TED Talk, he does a great little couple of steps of how to warm up your voice. And then finally, practicing. Lots of practice, whether you do practice moderation with coworkers, whether you practice giving a presentation to people, whether you practice voice mindfulness in your everyday conversations. We get better and better at this through practice. So getting more mindful of your voice and your nonverbal communication and all the things that we've been talking about, the more you practice it, the more natural it will be for you. And the more natural it is, the easier it'll be once you step into the lab or once you have conversations with other folks. So in conclusion, the psychologist's voice is the practice of voice mindfulness. Use your psychologist's voice to exhibit that voice mindfulness. Use those components that I talked about, being mindful of all those different components, the power, where your voice is coming from, the smoothness and warmth, the depth of your voice, the pace with which you're talking. These are all ways of being mindful of what you're saying, with the end goal of putting participants at ease so that we get the best data possible. And we don't want to wind up with this last quote from Sound of Silence, where people are talking without speaking, people are hearing without listening. By using our psychologist's voice, we can talk with speaking, and hopefully people will hear with listening. And we should be listening, again, actively listening, so that we're always hearing participants and thus can speak with talking. So thank you for listening today.
presentation. So we're going to get some of your questions answered, so feel free to post them in the sidebar. So as we go through, we have one that says, how could we leverage our psychologist's voice to be comfortable enough to provide us with negative feedback?
To provide us with negative feedback. Can you ask that again?
Yeah. How could we leverage our psychologist's voice to be comfortable enough to provide us with negative feedback?
Oh, I see what you're saying. So to get the participant to provide negative feedback. Well, that comes back to the open and honest. And one of the things that we always say, we should be saying when we start a usability study, for example, is I am not the designer. I did not design this. You're not going to hurt my feelings. This is all about you being an expert and helping us make this a better thing. So by using your psychologist's voice, you'll keep people comfortable. You'll build that rapport with people. And then once you have that rapport, they should feel more comfortable to give you that negative feedback. And then when they say something negative or maybe move on quickly, we can go back to that and probe a little deeper, and hopefully they'll feel nice and comfortable because we've been using our psychologist's voice.
Great. Another question is, you mentioned speaking from your chest or belly. How would you say that that's done?
Okay. So that's really about, again, where our voice is coming from. So that's essentially done in the throat. By closing off your throat, you may start talking through your nose, and it gets a little high pitched, and you don't have the power. So by controlling it, controlling the air in your throat, that's where you're either going to talk from your head or talk from your belly.
Great. This person often finds it challenging to find a balance between concentrating on their voice mindfulness and keeping track of the protocol, empathizing with the participants, and collecting data. Do you have any suggestions for that?
Yeah, that's actually my favorite part of moderating, honestly, where we are a one-armed paper hanger trying to actively listen to what the participant is saying, writing down what they're saying or note-taking, and then plotting what we're about to say. So what I tell people in this is that one of the most important skills a good moderator can build is a buffer, building the buffer in your mind so that you can listen to what the person is saying and process that, let it flow out of your fingertips so that you are note-taking, hopefully verbatim what they say, and then while that's going on, plotting what you're going to ask, that follow-up question. So it's really all about that buffer and being able to keep as much in your mind as possible.
Great. This person suggests a book called The Voice Book, which they reference, but they were wondering if you had any other suggestions on books as well.
I've never heard of The Voice Book, and I'm going to go check that out. That's awesome. Actually, the one I would definitely suggest, and I'll bring it back up on the screen, is where I got, oh, no, too far. Where I got this, Arabian, Silent Messages, Implicit Communication of Emotions and Attitudes. This is really about nonverbal communication. And yes, it's from the 80s, but it's still pretty apt.
Great.
Oh, and in other moderation books, so Moderating the Usability Study, I think that was Beth Loring and Joe Dumas. That's a great one. And Fiona Tranquata and Donna Tedesco's book. I'm blanking on the name. It's like sticky UX situations, but it's how to handle strange situations in the lab.
Great. And I think that's all the questions that we have for today, unless anybody else has any further. Oh, someone just popped in and said Moderator Survival Guide.
Thank you. Yep, Moderator Survival Guide.
So I think that's it. If anybody else has any further questions, you can reach Dan by his email, dberlin@madpow.com. You can also reach out to us through our Twitter @madpow or using #MadPow. And we will also be sending out slides shortly. So with that, it's all the time we have for today. slides and video will be available on our site in a couple of days, so notifications will be sent through email and social media channels, so be sure you're following us on all of that to learn about upcoming webinars, speaking engagements, events, and more. And thank you so much for joining us today. Stay tuned for more information on our next webinar in December on Sustainable UX with James Christie. For more information on that, we will be sending that out with any email.
And thanks for everyone for listening in today. I hope you found this useful. And don't hesitate to reach out if you have any further questions. Again, dberlin@madpow.net or @banderlin on Twitter.
Great. Thank you, Dan.
Thanks, everyone.